Hello, all. Welcome to today's webinar hosted by DDEL, addressing the intersection of bilingualism and disability. We are all happy to have you here today, and just want to talk a bit about what we're going to be achieving. We're hoping that this webinar will provide you an opportunity to really reflect on some of the theoretical and pedagogical ways we serve our students who are bilingual learners, and expose you to more, encourage the exposure to more than one language at school and home, and dispel many of the myths that are out there about how we should serve our students. I want us to introduce our panelists. We have Dr. Steve Przymus, from Texas Christian University, Dr. Alba Ortiz from University of Texas at Austin, Dr. Todd Fletcher, Associate Professor at University of Arizona, and Mr. Xavier Vasquez, Director of Bilingual Education in Fort Worth Independent School District. Thank you all, and I'm going to hand the presentation over to our panelists.
Good afternoon, everyone. This is a pleasure for us, and this is so exciting to see so many participants coming on. Thank you for joining us. Thank you, Dr. Lindo. Thank you, Xavier, Alba, Todd, for agreeing to join me in this presentation. Over the next 40 minutes or so, we're going to be talking about the intersection of bilingualism and disability. And one way that we've come up with to address this and to talk about some of the myths associated with bilingualism and disability is to couch these myths and this content in a couple stories. So we've thought through some children that we know from schools and some cases of school personnel talking to us, asking about this, what program should these students be in, how should they be served. And so we'll start off with a vignette, then talk about some of these myths and address them, show the empirical research that dispels these myths. And then the second part of our presentation will be another vignette and then service-related myths. So I'm going to jump in here, and India, do you control the screen? Do I have to say, go on to the next screen? Looks like it. Or if I do remote control, am I able to control it? Oh, there we go. Okay, so our agenda for this afternoon is to mostly address common misconceptions about the intersection of bilingualism and disabilities. And kind of how we'll do this is a panel format. I'll be sharing the content on the slides, and on any slide, Alba and Xavier and Todd, feel free to jump in with comments. And we may spend a while on one slide talking, having a conversation about this, or we may spend a little time on a slide and more on another one. So that's kind of what it'll look like. We'll talk about the implications of these common misconceptions, implications on instruction and intervention, on decision making, and policy and law. So the first vignette that we're going to put out there and ask you all to kind of think about maybe a similar situation in a school, a similar student that you might have in mind. These vignettes are based on real stories, but we use pseudonyms and no institutional names will be shared. This first one has to do with an English learner who is removed from bilingual education program and placed in a general education English-only program. Largely due to underlying misconceptions regarding bilingualism and disability. So here's our first student we're going to be thinking about. So the first student we'll talk about is Mateo. And a little bit of background about Mateo and the decisions made about Mateo. Mateo started bilingual speech services in kindergarten. After being assessed in both languages, he qualified with a specific learning disability in reading in 2nd grade and started receiving both special education inclusion services in his dual language classroom and pull-out resource services. At the beginning of 3rd grade, the speech language pathologist, in thinking through her schedule for the year, found that he had been removed from dual language and placed in regular programming, which is what the school calls a general education classroom, an RP classroom. This placement decision had been made at the end of his 2nd year between his dual language teacher and the 3rd grade regular programming or general education teachers. Upon learning about this change, the speech language pathologist contacted mom and explained the change in placement to her and found out that the mom had not given permission for the change. Mom didn't realize that this meant Mateo would no longer be with his twin brother, who stayed in dual language classroom. A little bit more about Mateo. He expressively uses more English, but receptively is strong in both. His mom speaks only Spanish, and after being explained her rights, she ultimately decided to leave Mateo in the all-English regular programming. So I want to stop here and kind of let this sink in. I know some of you on the panel, Xavier, Alba, and Todd, have some thoughts about some of the decisions that were made along the way regarding Mateo. And so I'll open it up to the 3 of you to make some comments, especially regarding the decision making.
Well, Steve, a couple of things to note here in terms of the agenda.
Yep.
And I think we can see overvention and instruction that was at first, designated, and also just issues with regard to the process for decision making that were not founded in policy, whether that's state or federal policy, and of course, there is a whole bunch of guidance in terms of the admission review and dismissal committees, and then also the language proficiency assessment committees that apparently in this particular scenario don't seem to have been followed.
The only other thing I would add is that this oftentimes happens before the multidisciplinary team meeting. So the professionals will get together and decide what decision they're going to make and not involve the parent in those discussions. And essentially they're doing it so that everybody's on the same page when they get to the formal meeting.
Right. Well, thank you both. I think that what we see in here could be in part explained through some of the common myths that we want to talk about in this webinar. And so we're going to talk about these 4 myths that you can all find in a National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine 2017 book, Promoting the Educational Success of Children and Youth Learning English. And this is specifically chapter 10, which is dual language learners and English learners with disabilities. We'll take these myths one at a time and talk about what they are. And in the following slide, we'll provide the research that dismantles these myths. But I want to, before we jump into these, I kind of want to say that this webinar is not in any means meant to be hard on teachers. Teachers always work from the best decision that they believe is for the kids and advocate for kids. But what we want to express today is that a lot of those decisions come from a folk theory, a gut feeling, sometimes trying to understand bilingualism from a monolingual view, a monolingual paradigm. And we see those in these common myths that I've heard multiple times, and I'm sure you probably all have as well, such as myth number 1, exposure to or learning more than one language will overwhelm and confuse children with disabilities. Myth number 2 is similar to that, and it says existing learning and language deficits will be worsened by exposure to more than one language, limiting the ability of these students to successfully learn in English. And these two myths, what they have in common is essentially these myths are the intersection of bilingualism and disability. And we have bolded here more than one language, and that somehow is the impetus for the disability or for the confusion. And that's the myth that we really want to dispel today. A third myth we're going to talk about, which unfortunately I continue to hear in schools, and many of you probably have as well, is that English learners should stop using their first language at home and at school in order to learn English. This is a very strong folk theory that goes like this. Longer time in English means they'll learn English better and faster. And this folk theory flies in the face of a lot of empirical evidence that we have that using bilingual education strategies tap into the whole linguistic experience and lived experiences of kids. And through those strategies, kids learn English faster and better. And we'll share some of that. And the final one is a myth that a lot of you may be familiar with as well. And that goes that code switching is somehow evidence of confusion and disability. All of these, as I explain folk theory, have to do with this gut feeling of people hearing multiple languages heard from children who have been identified with a disability in reading or writing or a language-based disability, and from hearing more than one language, maybe trying to describe bilingualism through a monolingual paradigm. But let's get to some of the evidence that dispels these myths. So if we take the first two myths that have to do with the intersection of more than one language and some kind of confusion or overwhelming a system or causing a disability, there's just a trove of empirical research, much of it coming from the 2016 special issue in the Journal of Communication Disorders, that shows that communicating bilingually for English language learners is just a part of their lived experiences. Something they've learned to do since they were very little. Something that if we were able to look inside their brain, we would see they're using one unified linguistic system and are not being confused by speaking or being exposed to multiple languages. And then other research has shown that English learners are not at any greater risk for language learning than monolinguals with the same disability, and that their language impairment creates no more extra challenges than those faced by monolinguals with a language impairment. Some of the interesting studies in this area have shown when you count words in both named languages, so a vocabulary study, that English learners outperform monolinguals with the same language impairment. And then moving on to, and I guess I can stop. Xavier, Todd, and Alba, feel free to jump in at any point with some of this. I'm going to go on to the next myth. And this is an important one that we unfortunately continue to hear, that English learners should stop using the first language at home in order to focus on English. This taps into the other two as well, that somehow continued exposure at home will confuse them. It'll worsen an already impaired language system, and we just know this not to be true. And more importantly, if we think about the importance of family culture, of values, the ability to continue being involved in a bilingual community, life and education goals are very important considerations in choosing the language of instruction, and should be conversations in the ARD meeting and in developing the IEP. Very importantly, that limiting communication, making this decision to stop using the home language at home, limiting communication between parents and children, and making it less natural and less intimate, can lead to negative psychological effects.
Steve, I'd like to just share with our audience, or have them to consider really what's at stake here when we emphasize one language over the other. Basically, what we're advocating is that subtraction in this particular case, as it relates to language, is better. These children have an opportunity and have been exposed, many of them simultaneously, to both languages from a very early age. And so for us to emphasize one at the risk of losing the other just is really something really hard to really consider. Here are potentially emerging bilinguals that we have that are going to be able to communicate, reason, listen, speak in both languages. And it's basically, if you want an example, it's just like cutting one of your arms off and deciding which one is more important.
I think that's also important. What's also important here is that states like Arizona, who passed the Proposition 203, eliminating bilingual education in effect and making programs only available for kids who are fluent in English back at the beginning of 2000, had a significant impact upon students who are then placed in structured English immersion classrooms. And some of the research that we did indicated that the inability, or the state law saying that don't dare speak Spanish in school, teachers couldn't even make comments or explain additional concepts to help these kids understand what they were being taught. And so we haven't talked so much, but here it does talk about the emotional development. And our study indicates very clearly the psychological issues that came up when these children were told that they couldn't use their native language. They were put in these classrooms, and it took a toll on not only the children, but the parents. So this is very, very important. Of course, that's changed now to some degree in Arizona. So we have kind of gotten back a little bit with dual language programs, but this is really critical.
Yeah, I would like to add to that the disability doesn't really matter, and the severity of the disability doesn't really matter, because people think the more severe the disability, the more important it is for the student to be taught in one language. And sometimes that may be true, but that doesn't mean that that one language should be English. You have to think about, you know, which language will get you the greatest outcome for the student. The other is that, you know, there's not a lot of research, but it's very consistent. The students with disabilities who stay in the dual language programs outperform the English learners who had never been in a dual language program, and they outperform the students that were taken out of the dual language program. And so I think the language issue is complicated because the research may not make sense to people without a background in language acquisition. So it makes common sense that one language is easier, but if you're bilingual, it makes no sense at all.
Yeah, wonderful, wonderful comments. Thank you all. You know, I keep, on this point here, I keep going back to the vignette with Mateo, who starting in 3rd grade will no longer have the same educational trajectory as his twin brother. A decision is being made that it might eventually impact how he communicates with his mom, who speaks Spanish, how he communicates with other family members, and that this could likely have an impact on emotional development.
Steve, if I could make a comment, because one of the participants has made an excellent point. The bilingual education programs are English programs, And so students are going to be taught English as a second language in the process as a requirement of policy and law.
Mhm.
One of the things that happens, though, is that there are bilingual education program models where students spend quite a bit of their time receiving instruction in a language other than English. And I think that's when people get confused or concerned, that they're thinking they're not going to get enough English instruction. So I think the point is well taken, that when you have a student with a disability, you've got to have the native language accommodations and adaptations for the disability. You have to provide them access to English as a second language, along with the accommodations and adaptations for the disability. So I just want to confirm that we recognize that it's a bilingual education program for that reason. It's more than 2 languages. The other question, Steve, that's coming up is whether people are going to have access to the PowerPoint. Would you like to answer that?
I definitely can share this PowerPoint. I'll send it to the folks at DDEL. India, I'll send you the actually, India, I sent you the PowerPoint at the beginning of this. So if you don't mind posting that in a way, thank you so much.
Steve, one other point with regards to the student that was exited that we're talking about. The mother was consulted kind of after the fact and was convinced that, yes, this program seemed to be the best program for her. I'm not sure if that's because of the particular orientation of the teachers and their belief system about what that looked like. So I think that's really a critical thing, because according to federal law, kids can be provided instruction in their native language in special education, or if not provided native language instruction, some type of program objectives clearly written based upon second language acquisition principles about where the student is, and to develop a really good program to ensure that if they're not getting native language instruction, they're getting good English language instruction at the same time. But my thought goes back to this parent and what actually took place. And we all sit in on IEP teams and meetings and making decisions. And I think it's really critical that we think through how parents are either told what to do or they're asked and consulted, because sometimes parents' perspectives aren't considered.
Yeah, Todd, I'm glad you brought that up. My sense is that it could have gone a lot longer without the mom even knowing that the change happened. The role of the parent, you're absolutely right. This wasn't done right. And the role of the parent will definitely come up again in the second vignette, which has a different outcome and a couple different players in there. So I look forward to bringing that up again, because I think that's an important thing to talk about. The last myth that we want to share, and here we go. It takes a little while after I click a couple times and then I see it come up, so bear with me here. Is coming up a little bit, and it's this idea of code switching as evidence of language confusion and disability. And code switching, my area of research is bilingual education, multiple language development, and we know that code switching has been studied for decades, but yet, from a positive point of view, but yet it continues to be seen in this negative light across different contexts. And we know that code switching from studies is just normal grammatical, it's correct, it's communicatively effective behavior, and does not indicate language impairment. However, there may be something to the term itself, code switching, that may sort of reify negative perceptions about it. So over the last 15 years or so, there's been more studies conducted, more articles written about translanguaging as perhaps a more preferred term for describing how English learners use their first and other languages in natural communication. I'm not sure how many in participation tonight are familiar with translanguaging, so we'll take one slide and define it and compare it to translanguaging a little bit. I think that'll be helpful moving forward, or compare it to code switching. So translanguaging refers to the language practices and abilities of multilinguals as they use their full linguistic repertoire while they're using their first and other languages for effective communication. Translanguaging includes features of multiple named languages. So when we hear someone translanguage, we may, from the outside, hear, oh, that sounds like Spanish, that sounds like English, that sounds like Somali, or however. But inside the individual's holistic linguistic repertoire or system, all of these linguistic features make up part of the individual's soul and unitary linguistic system, what some people call the idiolect. And this is individual by person. So as I said, from the outside, it appears that these individuals are switching between different codes or different languages or different linguistic systems, which is strengthened by the term code switching. However, but they're just selecting linguistic features that are, although socially recognized as different named languages, actually unified within and used as one linguistic system. That is their translanguaging. To put this theoretical definition into practice, my co-author, Manuel Alvarado, and I conducted a study over 3 months where we did several rounds of dynamic assessment analyzing language transcripts of content-based story retells with newly arrived immigrant students in a middle school. And in their story retells, we allowed them to translanguage. So we said, use your whole language to tell a story related to this content. And this didn't mean they went back and forth all the time. The target language of the school was English, so they would start talking about the content with their stories in English, but they didn't stop when they got to something they didn't know how to say. They kept going in Spanish or Tigrinya or the language of choice. And then they would go back to English and keep talking about the content. And when we were done, what we discovered is we knew a lot more about their content knowledge, and we knew a lot more about their language ability when we allowed them to translanguage. So this is the kind of the power of not limiting, kind of Xavier said, not cutting an arm off of an emergent bilingual or an English learner, not limiting them to one language at a time. We can see what they can show us and what they know, and we can make better decisions about them or with them. So the second vignette will take us, it's very similar to Mateo, but now we're going to hear about Efrain.
Steve,
And yeah, go ahead.
Before you leave translanguaging,
Sure.
I'd like to make the point that, you know, translanguaging is a common characteristic. All of us who are bilinguals do it all the time. In the process of instruction, ultimately our goal is that the student be able to communicate effectively in the language that's called for. So if it's in school, that they be effective. English users, if it's a dual language program, that they be able to use both languages effectively. And so as we think about disability, we want to think about whether students are making progress toward that goal, or if they're experiencing difficulty in comparison to students who are making progress. Because we don't want to overlook the possibility that the translanguaging practices may include features that are not correct or not appropriate to the context or to the linguistic system, and that those are the markers that you're looking for. I think you made a really important point that effective students who use translanguaging practices effectively communicate effectively, it's correct, it fits the context, and very importantly, others who are bilingual understand exactly what they're saying. And so I think that that's a differentiation that we have to be concerned with. Is it appropriate, effective, particularly in terms of age and developmental level, or is this student an outlier in terms of the communication skills?
One other thing too, in addition to that, is that perhaps our children are just in a particular phase with regard to their use and their, you know, they're relying on the translanguaging aspect of it. The major point that we want to stress here is that we want to see them progress. to more and more, proficiency in either language. And that is a sign that they're kind of moving through that particular phase where they're not having to rely on it all the time or as much as they have in the past.
Yeah, those are great points. And, I encourage everyone to take a look at some of the more recent literature on translanguaging that encourages purposeful and strategic translanguaging as a way of making connections, of bridging the literacy practices of students, and not as the sole pedagogical method, because we do recognize that we have goals. We do recognize that we want them to be able to proficiently communicate in one language at a time. We also recognize that carving out the space to tap into their whole linguistic repertoire facilitates and lifts them up and gets them to a greater ability to communicate in one language at a time, if done purposefully and strategically. I think this next story is going to bring up a lot of questions as well. So let's briefly talk about Efrain, who's similar to Mateo. Actually, Efrain started bilingual speech services younger, even in pre-K. Around second grade, he had improved in language a bit, still had some articulation things that they were working on, but couldn't read yet. So the speech language pathologist contacted mom for consent to test Efrain, and mom shared at this time that the second grade teacher had been encouraging mom to switch Efrain out of dual language and into English-only regular programming or general education. Mom only speaks Spanish, was frustrated because she wanted Efrain to stay in bilingual education. And after being assessed in both languages, Efrain was found eligible for specific learning disability in reading during the second grade year. At this time, the dual language reading teacher felt it made more sense to teach him to read in English because he was getting special education in English, and had pushed to have Efrain removed from bilingual education into regular programming. During the admission review and dismissal, or the ARD meeting, what may be called in other states multidisciplinary team meeting or a student assistant team meeting, the speech language pathologist overheard the dual language teacher saying that they were definitely going to switch Efrain to regular programming. However, during the ARD meeting, the mom refused to dismiss Efrain from bilingual education, and at that moment was backed up by the speech language pathologist, the administrator in the ARD, and as well as the diagnostician. So what came out during that is dispelling the myth that he wasn't confused because of the bilingual instruction, that he was struggling because he has a severe learning disability in reading. So this vignette introduces new characters, such as the mom taking a greater role, the admin being in the meeting, and I wonder if the three of you want to comment on this.
Well, first thing I just want to mention, the fact that the administrator is involved and helped, well, as a part of the team, he made this decision. We know the importance of the principal in the school, and an informed and educated principal that knows about second language acquisition, knows about English language development, and knows about bilingualism. And those are rare. So we don't know anything about this administrator per se, whether that was the case, but I think that's really an important element here.
Yeah, I agree.
I would like to add also the fact that as an administrator on the campus, the administrator has the opportunity to have insight and a relationship with not only the ARD committee, but also the LPAC if he serves on the LPAC. And so that insight is just indispensable in helping to lead the process and to advocate for the child on two different fronts. The other thing too that is really important to note is that the individual administrator has the ability to approve and authorize whatever resources or support, changes in schedule, the amount of time, the pacing for the student in terms of the instructional accommodations. You know, they really are the best person to advocate and to put into effect safeguards to ensure that the student is being served appropriately through bilingual education and through special education services.
Thank you, Javier.
I do have a question about this. The DL reading teacher felt it made more sense to teach him to read in English because he was getting special education in English. Alba, I know you've talked about this a lot in terms of you know, the outcome, the reality, the setting, the context for a particular student, and what really is probably best for the student, whether they should be taught in English or Spanish. And I don't know, what would you say about this particular case?
I think I mean, there's several factors that are in play. First question obviously is, what is the language of literacy instruction that the student is receiving? And so if it's in the native language, I think it's always a good idea to remain in that language if the student is having difficulty. I think you also have to think about the transition to, or the development of the English skills in tandem, and working from the native language skills to transfer those skills to English reading. I think the dilemma oftentimes is the issue that we don't have very many special educators who are bilingual. And so then it becomes really important that there be close consultation between the dual language and the special education teacher. The special education teacher should be supporting the classroom teacher in terms of what strategies, accommodations, adaptations are required to address the disability. At the same time, the dual language teacher should be working with the special education teacher, who may be providing support in English, but that has to be provided using English as a second language strategies. So I think it's important for everyone to bear in mind that you're a duly identified student, regardless of what context you're in. So you need the supports across contexts, and then working with parents who can provide tremendous support in terms of native language development is always critical.
Yeah, I think those are excellent points. The other thing is then the special ed team, the IEP team, needs to document that and make sure who's responsible for doing what, and making sure that these things actually occur. So I think that's critical.
Right. And one of the things I would suggest is that schools and districts look at their IEP form, because most of the ones that I've seen are designed for monolingual intervention. And so when that's the format that you're programming for one language, you don't always forget that you need to look across the goals and objectives and think about what are the content goals and what are the language goals, particularly if it's in an area like literacy. When are you going to do native language? When are you going to do English? And who's responsible for doing it?
So I think what both of you, all of you have been talking about leads into these service delivery myths. And this was a great presentation that I saw from Texas Education Agency about common misconceptions about dually identified students. So if bilingual education, special education, you have to choose one. And what you were all just saying is that the student qualifies for support from both programs. That student has the right to access services from each one. And as Todd was saying, and Alba too, this should be delineated in the IEP. This should be very, very clear how this is happening. Xavier has brought up the ARD committee and the LPAC, the Language Proficiency Assessment Committee, and I appreciate that because I think I have heard this myth as well, that the disability trumps the language status. So the special education services somehow trump the language needs of the student, and this is not the case, and that both should be working in tandem to make the best decision for a duly identified student. And then finally, Oh, that might have been the last one, actually.
I'm
Alba?
sorry.
Yep.
Before you go there, there are a couple of questions that I don't know if everyone is seeing, which I think are really important questions. One is the case where you have bilingual parents and the student has limited proficiency in the native language. And so, you know, what are the implications for that? I think that's important because people sometimes assume that if the student is bilingual, their native language is a stronger language. And if those skills are deficient, then that kind of supports the referral to special education. So I think that there's always the intersection of the student's language proficiency and the program that they're enrolled in. And that you have to consider those two things as you make the decision about the language of instruction. And I happen to believe that you lead with the strong suit. And so that becomes really important in terms of understanding the student's language proficiency and then monitoring to see how it's developing. And so this is a student who could be bilingual, but they may be being supported a little differently from the ones who really are limited in their English proficient and have stronger native language skills. So someone else may want to comment on that, but there's another question also on the table that I'll just put on the table so that anyone can comment on, and that's whether children go through an expressive language delay, particularly at the younger ages compared to monolingual children.
So this is a great question because this often feeds into the myth that they're confused. We often hear this. And I would love to hear Todd and Xavier and Alba weigh in on this as well, is to me, and what I've seen in some of these vignettes that I've put together is the interaction that the student has with the teacher. If the student has a feeling that they are not accepted or the teacher doesn't or wants them to be in a different setting, a different program, or however, it can be very difficult for the student to want to express. Their affective filter is almost 100% high all the time in the classroom. We've actually seen from some of these stories that when they got out of the dual language classroom, they started speaking more of their native language because the risk wasn't as great as it was when they were in the dual language. Not that I think that's the best decision, but I will say that the interaction, the identity development of the student and the interaction between the teacher will have a great deal to do with how they express themselves with the teacher in the classroom.
I think also another thing too is that sometimes unconsciously there is some micro messaging that is sent in the classroom that the children, even though they're very young, are very astute to picking out and to see for themselves in terms of what language preference is being being utilized in the classroom. And then again, we cannot forget the influence of peer pressure on the students as well. Everyone wants to belong, and they have a sense of and they have that need, right, at that particular age as they're developing. And so, you have many factors, many variables that are contributing to that, that disposition toward, kind of being a part of the overall community. The other thing outside of the classroom is how does the overall campus view another language? What is the micro messaging there? Are the announcements made in both languages? Is there labeling in the campus that supports the community, the school community, in their understanding of the development of both languages? And so, there's a lot that goes into it, and our children, once again, are very astute. They pick out and they know, and so they start to make these decisions. They start formulating what is acceptable, and so then that leads them to put into practice those things that they feel are going to be accepted.
Yeah, I would comment. I think that anytime you're looking at language proficiency, you want to look at exposure and experience particularly in the context of the home. But you also have to look at the program of instruction, because we're doing some work with students in transitional bilingual education. And under the radar, the message that teachers have gotten is that they need to transition the students as quickly as possible. So the transition actually begins in kindergarten with the goal of making sure that kids are ready to take tests in English by 3rd grade. And so the kids that we're working with have very limited, in our case, Spanish language skills, and they are English dominant, even though their parents are dominant in Spanish. And so that's the effect of instruction. I'll just quickly comment on some of the other questions that were asked in relation to this. It isn't uncommon to see that very young children seem to be experiencing expressive language problems in comparison to monolingual peers. But that tends to be because we're looking at their production in only one language. If you look at the production across languages, then they tend to be as expressive or more so than their monolingual peers. And in the early ages of development, parents will be concerned that their children will be confused and that the exposure to the 2 languages may be problematic, but it really is a stage in that process that kids overcome and then do very, very well. And so one of the other questions that was asked was about kids, in birth through 5 programs. That to me is probably the biggest issue we have in the field, because we don't have very many dual language programs for children that young, and their instruction tends to be in English, and it tends to be in English without any English as a second language support. So we have kind of a breeding ground for language and learning disabilities. And so I think we really need to think about professional development focused on dual language acquisition for very young children, and then the role of parents in terms of supporting native language development, even if the school feels it can't.
Yeah, you're placing kids in a sink or swim situation. Also, when you talked about English only policies, when you have repressive language policies in states such as Arizona had, it leads to this whole thing. We know, research versus ideology, which we haven't mentioned, but we know there's a lot of evidence for the impact and the power of becoming bilingual or multilingual.
Yeah, and
go ahead.
I'm sorry, I was just going to make the comment that one of the things that's very interesting to me since the emergence of dual language programs that include monolingual English-speaking children, you've seen kind of a sway to supporting dual language for monolingual English speakers, which kind of flies in the face of what we've been telling parents, or what parents have picked up, that dual language will be confusing to the child, they won't be able to learn it. English is the language of America, so to be a citizen and patriotic, you've got to acquire English. So let's minimize native language. And I think we really have to think about the fact that parents of English learners still are getting that message, while many monolingual English-speaking families are getting the message that you need to be bilingual in a global economy. It opens doors. You have economic privileges that come with that. And so we don't want to create another inequity in moving to dual language instruction for everyone.
Steve, you could probably speak to this, because in Tucson, that's what we've seen, is that the bilingual programs in the south of the city have been totally eliminated, although they're coming back. But yet we have the well-to-do school districts that now have dual language programs, which is seen as kind of an elitism now. So that's really what I think what you're talking about, Alba. I don't know, Steve, your kids were in the program, so.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Todd. And this is it's not an anomaly just to Tucson. You can find in higher socioeconomic status in neighborhoods, you can find more opportunities for bilingual education. I want to say something to what Xavier and Alba and Todd, you were all mentioning, is the messaging here. And Xavier, you had mentioned signs in schools, and research I did a while back, I looked at over 100 signs on bilingual campuses. 98.5% of the signs had English listed first, English listed on top, English in unmarked English in blue, which is the most popular color of Americans, Spanish in red, which comes in 7th, and often denotes anger and frustration and the wrong answer. And so there are implicit messages going on about what the status of languages are in school. And it's not surprising that kids, as you say, Javier, are perceptive and pick up on that in schools as what language I should be speaking, or limit themselves to a degree.
One thing that I do want to address about the preference about bilingual program, what Dr. Ortiz was talking about, I think a lot has been impacted with regard to how we view bilingual education over the years. Oftentimes it's been reviewed as a remedial program for students. And so during what Dr. Fletcher was, as he was speaking, I was starting to think about, you know, that's not so much the perception anymore. It's more enrichment, and you'll see and you'll hear lots of micro messaging on the positive side for dual language. So it's an enrichment program. Oh, so, you know, that gets the interest of everyone. And so there's been a shift, at least in my educational career, the shift from bilingual being a remedial program to now it's gotten the attention. And so now it's good for everybody. It's more enrichment-like.
But the climate in our country is very non-immigrant, which has a lot to do with people and their feelings and their self-esteem about the parents of kids who are bilingual. And so this has a very oppressive effect on our schools and on our kids and their self-identity, how they identify themselves. That's really a powerful message they're receiving from the top. And it's unfortunate because it really creates dilemmas in kids in terms of their own identity.
So we've moved into kind of a question and answer period, because I know Alba, it seems like you've been pulling some questions off of the chat or have been monitoring that a little bit, or the Q&A. We've gotten through the content we wanted to share with you all. Just to summarize our content, is exposing English learners to with disabilities to 2 or more languages is not confusing, is not going to cause a disability. And that bilingual education programs for English learners should support bilingualism, biculturalism, biliteracy, and lead to better academic outcomes for than compared to English-only instruction. And Alba, you had mentioned some studies about that. One that pops into my mind is Dixon 2013 found that students exited ESL services quicker, students with disabilities did, if they stayed in bilingual education compared to those in not. And then disability-related needs do not take precedence over language needs. Denying emergent bilinguals access to bilingual education constitutes discrimination on the basis of language status. And this has been mentioned that IEPs should specify language of instruction and appropriate placement. We're asking for everyone to be advocates here to ensure that educational policies protect the civil rights of English learners with disabilities. And access to some of the literature we've cited, you will have, if it transitions to the next screen. So we've got 5 minutes or so. India, do you want to go to Q&A and pick some and ask the panel?
Steve, can I make just one final comment?
Absolutely, Todd.
We have federal law which is backing up native language instruction. So in IDEA, it says that you must consider the language needs of the child if such needs relates to the child's IEP. And this includes whether the language of instruction should be in the student's primary language to deliver the services outlined in the IEP appropriately and meaningfully. So we do have, there's research, but there's also federal law which supports maybe more than the bilingual ed side so much, but special ed has a lot of power behind it in that way. I think we need to realize that and advocate based upon that federal law.
Yeah, well said.
All right. You do have quite a few questions here. Some of them have already been answered, so I've gone through. I know that one question is, can the presenters discuss how translanguaging and other evidence-based approaches / practices for bilingual students impact the assessment of these students?
Well, I'll just quickly, oh, no, go ahead, Alba.
I was just saying, that sounds like a Todd question.
No, well, I think I have a former student, Megan Farnsworth, who wrote an excellent article on this. I mean, Alba, you're really the expert on this, but I think I like the idea of informal assessments. You have to assess language naturally and with kids. There are formal assessments you can do, but they're oftentimes inappropriate and decontextualized. So I think it takes both quantitative and qualitative information to kind of get at the puzzle that these kids present, because they're hard to understand. This is not easy, the subject that we're talking about. This is very complex, requires basic research evidence, your own personal clinical experience maybe, working with kids, other things. So this is a very complex topic. And I wouldn't say that I'm an expert in that. I think, Alba, I think your way of dealing with it informally that you've talked about is very powerful and most meaningful.
Yeah, I would just quickly say that, number one, the law says that the instruments that we use have to be valid and reliable for the student population being tested. And so when you have English learners, there are very few of those around. Even those that are available in Spanish oftentimes don't fit the characteristics of the students that are being assessed. And so that's why I always think that the response to intervention, universal screening, progress monitoring in the context of the classroom, using approaches like dynamic assessment on the part of the teacher, become really important data to send forward to whoever's doing this special education assessment. Skills have to be assessed in the two languages. Students have to be given credit for all they know across the two languages, even when they give an answer that's not in the language the question is being asked in. So you try to tap into what is it that the student knows across languages, and what can they do. And so the student who's eligible for special education should be the one who, if you used formal assessments that show where the student was low functioning, that data are corroborated by informal classroom-based data that says, yes, we see the same thing when we use procedures that are more appropriate given the learner. And then I'm always a fan of getting the parents' perspective, because if parents think there's a problem and they usually tell you he's not like my other children, or he's not like somebody, the other kids that he plays with, then I'm going to take that to the bank, because parents are probably the most reliable source of information.
Thank you. I know our time is up. There was one last question that, there were lots of questions. I'll maybe let you share, and we can maybe have some posts to thoughts and response. But one question that might be a quick one was, what school district is doing a great job with the bilingual program? Do you have any models out there that folks might want to look at as guidance?
Well, I'll say it on behalf of Xavier, because he may not, but Javier's the director of bilingual ESL education for the Fort Worth Independent School District. And in the 4 years that I've lived in Fort Worth, I have seen Fort Worth to be very progressive in bilingual education, very open to rethinking traditional practice. And my own children are in public school and bilingual education programs in Fort Worth. So I think that may be one to take a look at.
Camille, can I ask you a question before you say goodbye? Is it possible to send some follow-up, like articles or references? I know there was some on the screen, but there may be some other things that we discussed today. Is there any way?
We would love that. Yeah. We would absolutely love to have any resources you'd like to share. We're going to post some things on our website, like white papers and resources around this topic as we go forward. So any resources you'd like to share, DDEL is happy to share with our members and on our website, so anyone can access. And I would ask about, I'll talk to you after, about the webinar itself, how we can post or maybe share some of the discussion we have here. I've gotten okay for the PowerPoints, thank goodness, because we've been getting emails like crazy. So I want to thank you all for sharing your time and insights with our community. I think I've taken over, so hopefully you can see the thanks for joining us and where you can find our DDEL website and those resources. But thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you very much.
Shout out to all the colleagues too that I know that are listening.
Yeah.
And have said hi. It's wonderful to see you're out there. We're on the front lines, still working and advocating for kids.
Absolutely. Well, thank you all. You guys have a good one.
Yes, maybe too. Thank you.
Thank you.